When it comes to animal agriculture, what our policy really focuses on is getting the government to stop investing in and subsidising the animal agriculture industry and take those resources and invest in growing and transitioning everyone to plant-based industries. And there's already amazing... job I'm in. I'm going to give you a really brief introduction to animal law, which is my background. I'm going to tell you what I do as Emma's policy advisor. I'm going to give you an overview of Animal Justice Party policies and what they involve, and I'm also going to talk about some recent wins before I hand over to some questions. So it's a lot to cover. It's going to be a little taster of everything. So if you've got questions at the end, feel free to ask me or come up to me afterwards. I'm really happy to have a longer chat, so feel free. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about myself to start with, and we'll dive into this. So I really discovered animal activism through the law, which is kind of an unusual path. But basically, I'd always grown up knowing that I cared about social justice. I wanted to go and get my law degree to make the world a better place, like so many people do. But I was really focused on human issues, human social justice issues. It wasn't until a chance occurrence where I took the subject animal law in my last year of university. I thought, that sounds so cool, I'm definitely going to do that. And it really just opened my eyes to how poorly animals are treated in our society, and particularly under the law, how the law is really used to oppress animals, and it really goes to the heart of how they're mistreated. So it was a completely transformative experience for me. I went vegetarian overnight, later became vegan. It really just took me on a different path. Although when I graduated law school, it won't shock you to know that there aren't a lot of jobs for animal lawyers. So I ended up working in litigation for a few years, which I really liked, but I felt like I was called back to animal law and I wanted to be able to do more. So a couple of years ago, I went overseas to America to get a master's degree in animal law. It's one of the only programs offered in the world over in Portland, Oregon. So I did that for a year, and then I was super lucky that when I came back to Australia, Emma just got elected, which is really convenient for me. She was looking for a policy advisor, and so that is how I ended up working with her. So I've talked about animal law and that being what I've focused on. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what that is, because I can tell you when you say you're an animal lawyer in the back of a taxi, you get a lot of confused questions about, is it animals suing each other, like what's going on? So in the middle of the slide here, I've got animals are property under the law. And that is a really central theme when we think about animal law. It's not just, I think when people think of animal law, they often think of laws that say we can't abuse animals. You know, you can't starve your cat, you can't abuse your dog. But it actually is so much broader than that. But at the heart of all of animal law is this concept that animals are property. So on one hand, that's kind of obvious. I mean, we know that you can go to a pet shop, you could buy an animal. We know agricultural animals are bought and sold. It's sort of we kind of understand that animals are property. But then at the same time, when you think about an animal, it's nothing like the other things in the property category. I mean, when you think an animal, you compare it to a chair or a table. They're completely different things. One is a living being with interests. It wants to, it has an interest in avoiding pain. It has an interest in avoiding suffering, while a chair or a plant, I guess plants are more of a grey area, but doesn't have an interest in those things. And so when you start to think about that and you start to unravel it, you realise that treating animals as legal things, as things that people can own and sell and use for their own purposes, it really goes to the heart of how we oppress animals. And I guess the contrast we often use is legal persons versus legal property. So legal property, animals, chairs, tables, houses, versus a legal person like all of us here today. We can hold rights. We can have certain rights under the law, not to be harmed. We can move about the world with certain rights that are protected, while a piece of property doesn't have rights. It's the subject of other people's rights. So we create this situation where animals are sort of doomed from the start, where we're treating them as property. So that's why some people in this space think that we actually need to change the legal status of animals if we're going to protect them property. We need to move them from being legal things to being something else, whether that's legal persons or something else that recognises that animals are actually living beings with their own interests. And so when you start to think about animal law like this, with this concept, you realise that there's a whole lot of areas that animal law covers. So I've mentioned some of the slides here, and I won't go through all of them today, but family law, so imagine a couple breaks up and they've got 2 dogs. What happens to those dogs? We know what happens with children. There's a hearing that decides what's the best interest of the child, but with dogs, what do? I mean, they're generally treated as property, something that should be split between the parties or sold and split between the parties. That doesn't really make sense when it comes to a dog that people have attachment to and that might have its own preference about who it wants to live with. So that starts to get really complicated. Consumer law is another really interesting one. So consumer law is the law that protects us when you're buying a consumer good. So if you're buying a faulty TV, consumer law is what protects you. If you buy a bad washing machine and it breaks down, that's what allows you to get a refund. These laws actually apply to animals in the same way because animals are goods. So it's actually been used in really creative ways, like if someone buys a puppy from a puppy farm, or they might not know it was a puppy farm, but they get it home and it gets really sick, and even if it dies or they rack up really big vet bills, you can actually use this same consumer law that applies to your broken TV. You can use it to actually try and get a refund or money back on the dog, which sounds kind of bizarre, but it's a kind of creative way that animal lawyers have been able to use law that exists to sort of help animals in a way. Another way consumer law can be helpful is it regulates claims that companies make about their products. So a big example is free-range eggs. So we all know that a lot of people have a preference for buying free-range eggs. They consider them to be a high welfare. They pay more for a free-range egg. But there have actually been quite a lot of cases where the ACCC, which is the regulator, has discovered that actually the people who were selling these products as free-range, they weren't actually free-range at all. They were, crammed in sheds, had no meaningful access to the outside. And so that was the way, again, the consumer law was used in a way to sort of help animals, or at least highlight to the public that the eggs that they were paying more for and felt like they were buying as a premium were not actually any different to the caged eggs. Obviously, environment and planning law is a huge area that touches on animals, whether it's native animals and the protection of their habitats and how much development applications are approved that affect their habitats, but also the protection or the treatment of non-native animals, so introduced animals, and I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more later. And then finally we do have the criminal law, which I'll talk about. So the criminal law is a key way that the treatment of animals is regulated. Here in New South Wales, it's the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is the main piece of legislation that says what you can and can't do in relation to an animal. Basically says that you cannot treat animals cruelly and you cannot treat them neglectfully. And that all sounds really good, and it does provide some protection for animals, but as some of you are probably aware, our laws are very speciesist. And what that means is that certain animals receive a lot more protection under the law than other animals. So companion animals are cats and dogs. They receive the best protection under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. They, if you do something to hurt a dog, most likely it's considered illegal under that act and you can be criminally charged. On the other hand, if you did the very same act to a farmed animal, like a sheep or a pig or a cow, that is often perfectly legal. So when we consider the practice of mulesing, which involves slicing off the buttock of a sheep, if you did that to a dog, you'd be charged. It's clearly illegal, it's causing huge pain. But when we do that to a sheep, it is perfectly legal, and that's because our law basically exempts those practices. It says when we do that to a farm animal, that's perfectly legal, as long as you comply with an industry code of practice about how you do it. And those codes of practice are pretty lax and also generally written by the industry. So that's where we start to get this problem where we've sort of got different classes of animals. Some animals treated quite well, other animals not treated very well. And it allows these horrible things that we know exist in factory farms to go ahead perfectly legally. The other sort of challenge with criminal animal law is that it's enforced primarily by the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League, at least here in New South Wales. And I think we all accept that as pretty normal until you start to think about the fact that this is a private charity that runs primarily on donations. The government in New South Wales, I think, funds 6% of the costs of the RSPCA. So when you start to think about it, it's kind of bizarre. We don't let any other criminal laws be enforced by a private charity. Like we expect that to be the job of the government and the job of the police. But for some reason, when it comes to animal law, we've got this situation where private charities are having to send out emails, post on Facebook. I'm sure you've all seen, saying, hey, help us out, give us money, help us enforce the law. It's kind of a bizarre situation, and one that I think people are starting to re-examine, particularly in New South Wales Parliament with Emma and Mark. They're sort of pushing and saying, is this the right way we should be enforcing animal law? So that's my very quick crash course in animal law. So I'm going to run down very quickly what I do as policy advisor with my legal background. So it's a pretty varied role, and one that changes a lot depending on whether Parliament's sitting or not. So Parliament sits, I think, about 14 weeks in the year, about 3 days a week. So those are the weeks where we're actually doing what you see when people are there in the chamber, in question time, asking questions, debating legislation. The rest of the time, we're sort of doing the behind-the-scenes work, preparing for those days, meeting with ministers and trying to sort of advocate for what we want to happen. So, as I've said on the slide, meeting with ministers or government officials is one of the key things that we do, particularly when we're not sitting, and it's one of the best things about having two members of the Animal Justice Party elected, because we can get these meetings that it would be really hard for an external group to get. So we can sit down with them and say, this is a really important issue, we really think you need to be thinking about it. So some meetings we've had this year is that we've met with the Attorney General and spoken with him about these horrible videos called crush videos, which involve horrible animal torture, and explained to him that they're actually not illegal in New South Wales and we need to introduce laws to stop people possessing and watching these videos. We've met with the Minister for Families to try and strengthen laws around working with children's checks for animal abusers. And we've met with the local government around pound reform. And all of those meetings have gone pretty well and everyone's been pretty receptive to our ideas. So that's a real advantage of having the Animal Justice Party in Parliament. And often we're raising issues that the minister's like, no one's ever told me about this before. Like, why am I just hearing about this? So it's good to have a new perspective, I think. I help Emma prepare for inquiries. So this has been a really big part of the 2 years that Emma's been in Parliament. We've had great success in getting up inquiries about animal issues. So it's basically like a mini hearings held. We have experts come in about a certain topic. We hear about what they have to say, a report's written, and the government considers the report and whether it should do anything as a result. So we've had inquiries into battery cages, the use of animals in entertainment, our animal cruelty laws, which I was just talking about, koalas, kangaroos, greyhounds, and the dairy industry. So in 2 years, it's doing pretty well. So as policy advisor, my job is to read all the submissions that come into these inquiries, sometimes from you guys or from members of the public. Sometimes there's hundreds, so I read all of those and help Emma come up with questions to ask witnesses when they come in to give us evidence. So that ends up being a pretty big part of my job. And then so that's sort of what we're doing outside of sitting weeks. In sitting weeks, our focus is on preparing for Emma being in the chamber. So what I do is I look at what legislation the government has coming up and looking at, okay, well, what's this bill going to do? What's its effect going to be? Do we want to support it? Do we want to oppose it? Do we want to put up amendments to it to change it a little bit, to improve it? So that's something we're constantly doing. And often we don't have any notice that a government bill's coming up. So it's pretty like frantic pace. I help Emma draft speeches for when she's speaking in the House. So that could be in relation to her own bills that she's introducing or also on government bills. So we've recently had a very long debate in New South Wales Parliament about increasing penalties for animal cruelty because the government's introduced a bill about that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we also speak on a lot of bills not related to animals. So recently there was a bill in Parliament that unfortunately did pass, which was going to allow children as young as 14 to be detained indefinitely for blood testing in certain circumstances, and we thought that was really concerning, so we spoke against that along with a lot of other members of Parliament. So I also help draft questions for Emma for question time and help her prepare notices of motion. So those are like sort of mini debates we can bring on before the Parliament that help us sort of test the waters, see what people's attitudes are on a certain issue, and hopefully pass a notice of motion which sort of suggests that everyone in that in the upper house is on side on our issue. So we've passed a number of notices of motion since Emma's been elected, including one calling on the government to ban puppy farming. So that's great. So that's sort of a very quick overview of what I do. When we're at sitting weeks, it's a lot more busy. I mean, they're like sort of, I compare it to being in court as a lawyer, like they're very long days, very busy, when then the rest of the time we get a little bit of time to breathe and plot and strategize about what we're going to do next. All right, I'll keep going at a lightning pace. So, AJP policies. So I think I'm meant to be making you an expert in animal policy by the end of this, so I better do a good job. Animal Justice Party policies, as it says on the slide, are the things that the Animal Justice Party is going to focus on They're our core issues. And what the idea of it basically is to give the public more of an idea of what are the Animal Justice Party about. Well, obviously they're pro-animals, they want to look after animals, but what specifically do they want to see? What changes do they want to see? That's what our policies articulate. And they're divided into 3 categories here, and this is how they are on the Animal Justice Party website if you want to look them up. We've got animals, environment, and humans. But all of our policies really come back to animals. That's our party mission, that's what we focus on. It's how can we improve the lives of animals. As a policy advisor to Emma, I'm not in charge of deciding what the Animal Justice Party policies are. What we do is put them into action. So we have some discretion as to which ones we want to focus on, what's strategic for us to focus on in New South Wales and Parliament, given what's happening, but we don't actually decide them. They're decided by a subcommittee of the Animal Justice Party. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, I know there are sort of capacity to get involved, and they basically consider how our policy should be developed and improved. We're a young party, we haven't been around that long, so our policies are always changing, growing, we're adding new ones, getting rid of old ones, so it's sort of a constant state of development. And basically what this policy working group does is they come up with a policy, then they send it out for consultation to our delegates and other people in the party, and then ultimately it's approved by our national committee. So that's sort of how these policies come to be. And anyone in the party at any time can sort of suggest a policy or suggest a change to a policy. So if any of you are sitting here thinking about something that you'd love to see the Animal Justice Party have a policy on that we don't, or have an idea, then I really encourage you to reach out, because they're really open to new ideas. All right. So I'm not going to be able to go through all the policies tonight. We've got a huge list on our website. I've put some examples of some of them up there, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things covered by our policies. Some of these policies are really straightforward, exactly what you'd expect from a party called the Animal Justice Party, but others are, I guess, a bit more nuanced or even slightly controversial. People have different opinions about them. So I'll just touch on a few of them. I mentioned earlier about the property status of animals and how important that is. So long-term, a goal of the Animal Justice Party, according to our policy, is to abolish the property status of animals, so that animals can be regarded under the law as more than mere property, but given some kind of special status under the law that recognises that they are living sentient beings, worthy of respect and worthy of certain rights. Obviously, that's a pretty big change to where we are right now. So our policies generally have some bigger goals, but also some interim goals about what we'd like to achieve. So sort of a shorter term goal under this heading is that we'd like to see the establishment of an independent Office of Animal Welfare, both in the states and on a federal level. At the moment, for example, in New South Wales, the Minister for Agriculture is responsible for animal welfare. And so you can see an obvious conflict there, where this is the minister responsible for growing the animal agriculture industry, yet at the same time he's also meant to be promoting animal welfare. There's an obvious conflict there, and so we think an independent office is something that's really important. Again, animal agriculture, obviously the Animal Justice Party many people in the Animal Justice Party would love to see a vegan world. That's not going to happen overnight, and it's not a realistic goal for us right now, even though that is something that a lot of people aspire to. So when it comes to animal agriculture, what our policy really focuses on is getting the government to stop investing in and subsidising the animal agriculture industry and take those resources and invest in growing and transitioning everyone to plant-based industries. And there's already amazing work going on in this space. I said that we had an inquiry recently into the dairy industry. Emma and I met with amazing experts and people working in this space who are helping farmers go from dairy farming to producing almond milk and other plant-based milks. There's work gone to regenerate land that's being used for animal agriculture so it can be used for other plant life. So there's amazing work going on in that space, and I think if the government was actually investing in that space, we'd probably be seeing a lot more progress here in Australia. So the last one I think I'm going to touch on really quickly, the second last one, is introduced animals. And this is one that is a little bit more controversial, I think, for a lot of people, and also one that sets us apart from some of the other parties like the Greens. So environmental groups like the Greens, their focus really is on the survival of the species. They want to focus on the survival of species, particularly native species. That's their perspective. So from that, when you're coming from that perspective, they're quite supportive often of methods used to kill off any threats to native animals, and that includes introduced animals like cats, deer, fox, etc. On the other hand, as an animal protection party, we don't take that view. We see each animal as an individual, a sentient individual capable of feeling pain, capable of feeling pleasure, and we don't distinguish whether that's a native animal, whether that's an introduced animal. We think they're all worthy of equal protection. And that's what our policy reflects. So we're opposed to cruel, lethal culling methods. And it's not to say that we don't recognise that harm is done by introduced animals to native animals. It's a really difficult conflict and one that we do think needs to be managed. The situation with the brumbies in Kosciuszko National Park is a perfect example of that. It's a very controversial, charged issue where people have strong views. Our focus really, particularly in Emma's office and also in our policy, has been to say, look, this is a situation that humans created. We brought these animals here. They didn't invade, as so often the language is used around introduced animals. It was brought here by humans, and we as humans have a duty to find a humane, non-lethal solution. So often we're talking about, immunocontraceptives, which are ways or fertility control methods that can be used to reduce numbers. Even so today, obviously, we would have all heard about the mouse population boom that's going on at the moment, and I saw that the government's finally today talking about investing in gene technology to try to reduce future mouse booms. I mean, this is clearly the way we need to manage these things rather than just culling, using poisons, aerial killing. I mean, these things have been around for a long time and they're not only incredibly cruel, but they're clearly not working because we're having these issues over and over. So our focus is on sort of taking a new angle there. And the last policy I'll mention is domestic violence, because it's one that sounds like it's more human focused, and it certainly is. We obviously care about protecting all people from violence and domestic violence. But one thing our policy does note, which is often overlooked, is that there's a really strong link between domestic violence and animal abuse. Australian studies have shown that 50% of women experiencing domestic violence also report that their animals were being abused, so there's a strong link there. And animal abuse in a home can actually be a marker that more serious harm is occurring in the family, both to the humans as well. And studies also show that there's a significant portion of women who delay leaving violent situations because they're concerned about their animals and what's going to happen to them and where they're going to take them when they flee the violent relationship. So, you know, we all know that people see animals as part of their family, but I think when we're talking about family violence, animals is often part of the picture that's being overlooked. So this has been a big policy focus for the Animal Justice Party at a policy level in Victoria and in New South Wales, and I'll talk a little bit more of that when I get to our wins. My thing's been cut off. Vote. So what happens when the Animal Justice Party has to vote on a non-animal issue? This is something we get asked quite a bit. So there's a few things we do here. Firstly, the MPs look to the values of the party, which are kindness, equality, rationality, and non-violence. So they think, we're guided by those principles. How would those principles lead us to vote on this piece of legislation? The second thing is that we do have some positions on human issues, things that we think is really important for the public to know where we stand. So that includes, we took a position on abortion, we've taken a position on asylum seekers, things like that that are just a really critical or perhaps a really important issue at the time that we've told the vote in public, this is where we stand. And finally, here in New South Wales, Mark and Emma, who are our two MPs, have come up with their own unity principles. So that's something they decided to do and put up on their websites about a range of human and animal issues, including economic justice, workers' rights, things of that nature, just to give people an idea as to how they're likely to vote on a particular issue. So I'm going to finish by talking about some of our recent wins, and hopefully this will bring together a few of the things I've been talking about today in terms of animal law, the policy, the work that we do, and sort of how we end up with these wins. So the first one is a ban on breeding and importing dolphins in New South Wales, which was such an exciting win that we got earlier this year. Obviously, this isn't something that we just achieved on ourselves. People have been campaigning on this for a really long time. But what we were able to do, because of Emma's role in New South Wales Parliament, is to get up an inquiry into animals in entertainment. So that was looking at animals in circuses, but also dolphins in captivity and dolphin shows. So she managed to get an inquiry up about this where the evidence that came out is what you'd expect. It highlighted the cruelty of keeping dolphins in captivities, the fact that keeping dolphins in captivity really isn't supported by the public anymore, and also the fact that in New South Wales we only have one facility left with captive dolphins, and even that facility is looking to retire the dolphins because it knows that the writing's on the wall and this isn't something that people want to see anymore. So After running that inquiry, we had petitions trying to build a lot of pressure. Emma was able to sit down with the Minister of Environment, Matt Keane, and persuade him to introduce legislations banning the import and breeding of dolphins in New South Wales. And that's really critical because it means that the 3 dolphins that we have in New South Wales now will be the last generation of dolphins in captivity for entertainment. There will be no way to get more in. We also got a recommendation in our inquiry that the government investigate removing the 3 remaining dolphins to a sea sanctuary to live out their days in a more natural environment. We're hopeful that the government will support that recommendation. It is a really complex issue. We'd love to see them move to a sea sanctuary, but as you can imagine, these are dolphins that have been raised in captivity their whole lives. There's a lot of welfare issues to consider in terms of how traumatic that move would be for them and whether they'd actually thrive in a new environment. So that was a really exciting win. The second win is new laws recognising the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. So as I said, this is an issue that we think was really important, but one that wasn't really being talked about and not really getting on the agenda when we're looking at domestic violence issues. So what Emma did was hold a roundtable with key experts in the space to look at this issue. So we had legal groups, we had animal groups, we had people working in the community sector, brought them all together along with a staff member of the Attorney General's office. And they highlighted what I said to you earlier, that this is a huge intersection and that something needs to be done to make it easier for people to flee domestic violence with their animals and also recognise the role that animals play. So as a result of that roundtable and continuing to work with the Attorney General, we managed to get 2 wins. So firstly, the Attorney General announced funding for shelters to upgrade their facilities to make them animal friendly. So that means that people who are fleeing violence are in those shelters able to bring their animals with them, which could be the difference between them staying in the relationship or leaving the relationship. And also, you know, when you think about women and children fleeing domestic violence, like not having to separate from your animals, you know, is a really good thing. It reduces a lot of that trauma. The second thing he did was introduce new laws which better recognise the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. Going back to this idea of animals as property, before these reforms were introduced, animals were lumped in the category of property when it came to a domestic violence dispute. So a standard order made in a domestic violence case is that you're not allowed to harm the property of the other person. So animals were just lumped in there, you're not allowed to harm an animal, but not giving that sort of recognition that animals are not just like damaging a chair, like the animals are part of the family and need special protection. So we managed to get some greater recognition there. There's a lot more we want to do in that space. There's a lot more reform needed, but it was sort of starting that conversation and opening the window there, which is great. The third win was new laws making it easier for animals to live in apartments. So basically what we did was pass an amendment to a strata bill, which will make it much harder for strata schemes to ban people from having animals in apartment buildings, which is quite common at the moment. These last 2 on the slide are not quite wins yet. I've sort of been cheeky putting them in there because I hope they will be wins soon. But just to update you, because these are things that we're working on at the moment. So the first is tougher penalties for animal cruelty. Right now, New South Wales has the lowest penalties for animal cruelty in the country. For an act of animal cruelty, the most you can get is $5,500 or 6 months imprisonment for a standard act of animal cruelty. And this is something that Emma's been talking about since she got elected, that this needs to change. There's been a whole lot of research. All the enforcement agencies say they need to go up, but the minister's just sort of been dragging their feet. So after getting sick of this, we decided last year we're going to do it. We're going to introduce our own legislation increasing penalties and try to push the minister. And it worked because the very same day he announced that he'd be doing his own bill increasing tougher penalties. So that we hoped was going to be a really good process. He was increasing the penalties to a good amount. We debated the bill back in March. The problem is now that the bill passed the lower house, it passed the upper house where Emma sits, but it passed the upper house with a few amendments, and it passed the upper house with a few amendments that the government didn't really like. So now they need to vote on that bill again in the lower house, and instead of doing that and making this happen, they're just sitting on it. Nothing's happening. So that's getting a bit frustrating. We're not quite sure what we're going to do about that. It might be that actually we're back in Parliament next week, that we're going to pick up our bill again and start pushing it through the Parliament process, because it seems like the government's not doing anything. So hopefully this will be a win soon, but sort of in progress. And similarly with puppy farming. So this has been a huge campaign of ours. It seems ridiculous that of all the things we should be able to get the government to ban puppy farming, but it's actually been so difficult. So we've been pushing the government at every angle. We've been getting a lot of media. We've done a big protest in Martin Place, passed notices of motion, we've asked questions, we've given the minister a petition that had over 40,000 signatures. And I think pressure is really building. I mean, we're hearing more and more from councils, particularly on the border with Victoria, who are getting development applications for these huge puppy farms, like 300 dog puppy farms. And they're frustrated because they're saying to us, we don't want this puppy farm, but the law doesn't exist to stop us and allow us to refuse this puppy farm. So I think the pressure is definitely building. And as a result, so the minister has not yet introduced legislation banning puppy farm, which we would like to see, but he is clearly listening to the pressure because last year, was it earlier this year? One of the two. He suddenly announced that he was going to set up a puppy farming task force within the RSPCA and give that some funding, which is really good in one sense because we're hearing stories of breeders being inspected for the first time ever as a result of this funding. Because as we were saying to the government all along, no one knows what's going on in these breeding facilities. We really need greater oversight. So in one sense, it's good. The problem is that puppy farming is still legal in New South Wales. So often the RSPCA will find these places. They might find a few dogs in really bad condition and they can get those out and maybe initiate some charges. But if they've got 200 dogs, there's nothing they can do. They can't shut that facility down unless it's really bad welfare or breaching certain standards. So it's sort of exposing the issue even more that we actually need to ban puppy farming in New South Wales, and then we can enforce it and get the RSPCA out there to shut it down. So we're working on our own legislation on this because the government hasn't been doing their job. So hopefully in the next couple of months that'll be coming out, and yeah, hopefully that will be on my proper wins list soon. That's all from me. I've talked a lot. Thank you.